after 2 o'clock. IT, you can start the stream. All right, good afternoon, members.
Afternoon, Chair.
Just give me one second. Just 1 second. All right, good afternoon, members. It is the 25th of August. It's just gone 2 o'clock. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Transport and Public Works. Just for the record, I'm Dalen Mitchell and I'm the chair of this committee. Members, I'm going to allow you an opportunity to introduce yourselves just for the record.
Good afternoon, Chair. My name is Terry Ricker. I'm the member of the committee.
Thank you, Honourable America.
I'm the member of the committee, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Mvimbi.
Chair Brett Heron.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. Honourable van der Westhuizen, if you can introduce yourself.
Don't you hear?
Honourable van der Westhuizen, there's a background noise. If you could just repeat that for the record.
Do you hear me now, van der Westhuizen?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Honourable van der Westhuizen. Members, I'm going to just switch off my camera to make sure that the streaming is to assist with the streaming of this meeting, if that's in order.
That's in order, Chair.
Thank you. All right, members, thank you very much for your introductions. Just for the record, I've received an apology from the HOD for this meeting, but I'm informed that Mr. Ahmed would be leading the presentation on behalf of the HOD and the department today. I have seen that Minister Madikizela has joined, so I'm going to allow Minister, just for the record, introduction from your side, and then to the officials that will be presenting today, if you can introduce you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairperson and colleagues. I am Bongos Madikizela, the MEC for Transport and Public Works. I'm here with my officials. I will allow them to introduce themselves. Yasir.
Thank you, Minister. Chair, good afternoon. I'm Yasir Ahmed. I'm the Chief Director for Transport Regulation, and I'll be doing the presentation. I'll put it up shortly after all of the other colleagues have introduced themselves.
My name is Kyle Reinicke. I'm the DDG for Transport Management in the department. Can I pass on to Deirdre?
Yes, sure, sir. You may do so.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Deirdre Bernard, Chief Director, Transport Operations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bernie McMahon, Director, Operating License and Permits.
Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mark Skrikker, Chairperson of the PRE in the Western Cape.
All right. Thank you very much for those introductions. Are there any officials that we have missed? All right, members, just for the record, I'm just going to go through the rules of engagement for this virtual meeting. I just need to bring to your attention that this meeting is held by using MS Teams, and that the meeting proceedings are also being aired via live feed on YouTube, which any interested person, institution or stakeholder may tune in to follow this proceedings. The guests on the MS Team platform, except for those presenting in respect of the meeting agenda, are not allowed to interact, and that is participate verbally without being requested to do so. Members, to indicate any technical assistance that you would need from the ICT staff, you must please do so by using the chat function, and the IT staff would provide you with the necessary assistance. All members will now be muted to avoid any background noises, and that in case members, if you want to bring anything to my attention during the course of this meeting, to please so by indicating by using the hand function on the MS Team function. Unless you are contributing to the meeting or speaking, may I please ask and request that you switch off your video and microphone, and only do so once you have been acknowledged to speak. All right, those are the rules for this meeting. Members, there's unfortunately no interpreting services available, and I would appreciate it if you could assist me by using English in the medium of communication for this meeting. Minister, before I hand over to the department, I don't know if there's any introductory remarks that you would like to make with regards to the agenda item that we will soon be embarking on discussing.
No, Chair, I really don't want to waste the committee's time. The team has prepared a very lengthy presentation giving the background, sketching the current scenario and the proposed solutions going forward. The presentation will cover all that, including the current challenges that we are facing with regard to the taxi violence in specific routes. And personally, I had a number of engagements with the leaders of Santaco and the associations that are operating in those routes, especially the mother bodies like Codeta and Kata. Even last week we had a meeting to try and resolve those issues. So there's been an ongoing, discussion, because I think, as I said, these issues are historic, and we have, done a number of things to try and deal with some of these challenges, because as I said, they're historic, and we are taking a multi-pronged approach in terms of trying to resolve them. But the presentation, as I said, will cover all that, and without further ado, I will now allow the team to just take us through the presentation, and we will then engage after the presentation, Chair, if there's a need for us to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. Ahmed, I'm going to hand over straight to you to take us through the presentation. May I please just ask that you be mindful of the time. This committee meeting is scheduled until 3:30, and I would like to provide the members with enough time to engage you on the presentation. So I would appreciate it if you could stick to 35 minutes with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will definitely try to do that. Can I firstly ask, can you see the slides? Chair?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much.
Members, are there anyone that cannot see the slides? Doesn't seem so. So, Mr. Ahmed, you can go straight into it.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick outline of the presentation. I just want to give some background to the regulatory environment for public transport, and specifically focusing on the regulatory entities. And then we'll get into the statistics on taxi-related crimes over the last couple of years. I'll touch on a couple of the current minibus taxi conflict hotspots, just to give you a sense of the causes as we have picked up on those. And then we'll delve into the root causes of the taxi violence and some of the interventions that have been put in place by the department and the City of Cape Town to address these root causes to try to stop the taxi violence. And then we'll go into the discussion. Firstly, the regulatory environment for public transport. Now, my apology if I am going into matters that the members are already familiar with, but just a quick background. Prior to 1980, of course, public transport was heavily regulated, and we had the local road transportation boards, and they regulated public transport as well as freight, in fact. And then there was the Van Breda Commission, or the Competitions Board, that did an investigation, and in 1986, a white paper actually recommended deregulation. That led to uncontrolled issuing of operating licenses, which resulted in severe overtrading. And at that time, more than 70% of routes in the City of Cape Town area were overtraded. In 1996, the white paper was published, and that led to the to the National Land Transport Transition Act being enacted. Now, Chair, this is not the first spate of taxi violence that we have in around about 2005. There was in fact the Nsebeza Commission of Inquiry into Taxi Violence, and that report was published in 2005, and it highlighted a couple of the causes of taxi violence at the time. Judge Dumisa Nsebeza focused on the recruitment practices by associations, which led to about 49% illegal operations across the province, route invasions and violent conflict, the mafia-style criminality practiced by associations, passenger safety being compromised as a result, and we're still seeing that, and also pointed to the Operating License Board at the time, the corruption and the capacity issues within the board. Since then, of course, the Operating License Board has been replaced by the Provincial Regulatory Entity, and that board has been completely overhauled. And new legislation, in fact, came into effect in 2009, and that is the National Land Transport Act. Now, public transport is listed in Schedule 4 of the Constitution as a concurrent function. And Member Heron, of course, having been with the city, will understand this. This is a matter, public transport is a matter which both national and provincial governments can make laws on, and there is also a very critical role played by municipalities. The National Land Transport Act and associated regulations were promulgated in December 2009. The NLTA must be used in union with certain provincial laws and municipal plans, and that's very important, and I'll come back to the integrated transport plans. The purpose of the National Land Transport Act is to continue the process of transforming and restructuring the land transport system, with particular focus on the minibus taxi industry, and that flowing from recommendations from the National Taxi Task Team, which did its work in around about 1996. The move from a supply-driven transport system to a demand-driven transport system based on plans is also pushed for in the Act, and it also introduces the concept of regulated competition. So this is not pure free market where anybody can just buy a minibus and start operating. It is regulated competition similar to shebeens that have to have licenses. Now, the regulatory entities that we currently have, firstly, there's the National Public Transport Regulator. It is responsible for receiving and deciding on applications relating to operating licenses or the accreditation for interprovincial transport and tourist transport services. Although at this stage, since August 2006, the National Public Transport Regulator has only focused on tourism transport services, and there are very many challenges in that regard. They also oversee fares, charge, and public transport services in the country, but that has not yet taken effect in the National Public Transport Regulator, which is still very much in the phase of building its capacity. Then, of course, we have the Provincial Regulatory Entity, and we've got Mark Skricker, the chairperson in the meeting, and also Bernie McMahon, the administrative head of the Provincial Regulatory Entity. Then the Act does make provision for municipal regulatory entities to be established, but municipalities actually have to apply to the National Minister of Transport for that function to be assigned to them. The Act also introduces the Transport Appeals Tribunal, and it is also covered in terms of its own legislation, the Transport Appeals Tribunal Act. The Provincial Transport Registrar is another entity which was established in terms of provincial legislation. That's the Provincial Road Transportation Act Amendment Law of 1996. And the registrar is responsible for registering and monitoring compliance of transport institutions and their members. In other words, of the taxi associations and their members. Now, the planning authorities, as I mentioned earlier on, all municipalities are planning authorities, and they are responsible for preparing integrated transport plans. ITPs include an operating license strategy and also an infrastructure record, and it also unpacks the supply and demand figures in terms of which the planning authorities will then give directives to the PRE in terms of whether it supports or does not support an application for a new operating license. I must emphasize here that the PRE is in fact bound by the directives issued by the planning authorities. In other words, if a planning authority does not support an operating license, the PRE may not issue an operating license in contravention of that planning authority's integrated transport plan. Now we come to the crux of the matter, the stats on taxi-related crimes. And I must thank the SAPS for the partnership that has really grown very, very strongly between our department, the city, and themselves over the last couple of years. But the statistics are extremely concerning. The number of murders in 2018 was 85. That came down slightly in 2019. And it is just spiraling out of control in 2020. Already 56 as at the 17th of August this year. Also a number of attempted murders and other crimes that have been defined as taxi-related crimes. Now, Chair, of course, there are murders, attempted murders, and other crimes that are committed that may be linked to gangs. These are crimes that have been specifically identified as being taxi-related. And I'll come back to the issue of enforcement and how the SAPS and our department are working together to firstly identify those crimes that are indeed taxi-related and what it is that we're doing to support the SAPS in identifying these crimes and also assisting with the investigations that are driven by the SAPS. Let's go now to the current taxi hotspots. Chair and members, many of these taxi violence hotspots come down to or come back to competition over long distance routes. We have Kata, Godeta, and Mredo, who define themselves as mother bodies, vying for control over the long distance routes. Operators are taxed and even issued with receipts, monitored by marked patrol cars and uniformed enforcers who issue spot fines if receipts are not produced. We've received reports that all minibuses, buses, tour buses, as well as family vehicles and funeral parlors are targeted. And if they cannot produce these receipts, they are taxed 6,000 Rand, 5,000 Rand if you do not have a receipt, or your vehicle will simply be parked at the rank controlled by that mother body. Now, of course, the long distance routes are leveraged by these mother bodies to access and gain control over local operations. And as we go into the other hotspots, you'll see the thread running through. So these, excuse me, these receipts that I mentioned, excuse me, these are real. They actually issue receipts as part of this act of what I call extortion. And the vehicles that are marked, they actually like parallel police vehicles. They patrol these routes. The enforcers have uniforms and reflective vests. And unfortunately, many of these patrollers have been victims of murders and attempted murders. Some of the current hotspots for taxi violence, we have Kata Bellville versus Kata Bloekombos-Wallisdien or Bluwata. Here we have tensions between two Kata factions over, firstly, dual membership and control over long distance routes. The department initiated a mediation process in 2019, but parties could not find common ground, specifically over the issue of who gets to control the long distance rank. But they committed to an arbitration process for which we appointed Advocate Tembelihle Zidaki, who was appointed via the state attorney. Now, the arbitrator's findings and recommendations were communicated to all parties in April this year, and it may be taken to court for a declaratory order to force the parties to accept the decision. They had, of course, agreed to upfront to abide by the mediation process. That didn't pan out that way, and then they agreed to abide by the arbitrator's recommendations and findings. Then we have Carter Boland versus PAL Alliance, PATA, who very recently aligned themselves to CODETA. Now, this is a dispute over the ownership, in inverted commas, of Route B97 and the Bellville Public Transport Interchange, which is a Carter stronghold. The Route B97 goes from Bokweni in PAL to Bellville. Now, Carter, Boland, and PATA operators, we found that both associations, in fact, have got members with operating licenses that allow them to operate on this route. But Carter is actively preventing legal operators who have aligned themselves to CODETA from operating at the rank. And the most recent shooting involved CODETA operators shooting at the rank, where a passenger, in fact, was fatally wounded. PATA, who's aligned to CODETA, PATA aligned themselves to CODETA for protection. And CODETA now is flooding the route with additional vehicles, most of these vehicles operating illegally between Bokweni and Bellville. Another conflict area is Delft. It is calm at the moment following a mediation process that our department initiated last year in 2019. The SAPS and our department are continuing to monitor the agreement that was reached in April of last year. My apology, that should be April 2019. The agreement was for Delft associations to accommodate 70 plus Carter operators who were operating illegally. There was a new mall, a development in Delft, and the associations argued that there was an increased demand for public transport services. The city has agreed to support additional operating licenses in Delft. Then there's Vrygrond Taxi Association that is aligned to CODETA versus the Retreat Taxi Association and also Steenberg Taxi Associations that operate in that area. CODETA aligned Vrygrond Taxi Association applied for additional operating licenses, including routes to Retreat Station. The City of Cape Town agreed and completed a new supply and demand survey in July 2019, and currently there are court cases and a PRE process underway to now regularize the additional demand that was identified by the city as we understand it. Then we have the Amapela, and Chair, you will recall this comes up in our standing committee for discussion regularly. Now, predominantly in the Lagunia townships, we have the sedan taxis that are operating, and here the conflict is between two Carter factions, who I call them the old guard and the young guns. The City of Cape Town, I think that's some 3 years back, maybe Member Heron will recall better than I can, but some 3 years or so back, the City of Cape Town agreed to support about 400 operating licenses for inter-township sedan taxis. However, fewer than 200 operating license applications were submitted, and even fewer still were uplifted. So of the 200 that applied, fewer than 200 were uplifted. And as I've mentioned before, Chair, in most cases it's because the operators cannot get a certificate of roadworthiness for the vehicle that is currently operating in the township, and that is a requirement that the PRE cannot relax in any way. The Houtpay to Cape Town route. Here again, we've got Carter versus CODETA. Houtpay operators, including Central Unity Taxi Association members, were contracted to operate the MyCity route between Houtpay, Camps Bay, and Cape Town. Now, in the process, taxi operators were compensated for that route. They were bought out. The MyCity buses are operating on that route, but Kata operators then started to operate illegally in parallel and in competition with MyCity. Kuta operators then aligned themselves to Kodeta to take back their route, and that has been the cause of that conflict now between Kata operators and Kodeta aligned Kuta members. The conflict areas are not just localized in the city of Cape Town. The conflict now is also spreading to areas like Ceres, again, where you have Kata and Kodeta aligned groups vying for control over local routes and interprovincial transport routes, transporting seasonal workers in Ceres, Grabouw, and these farming communities. Then in George and the Garden Route district, Kodeta has now recently established a long distance office. They do not have legal operators in the area. They've established this long distance office and they are recruiting local illegal operators, mainly from the ranks of drivers, to compete with Ungedo and also to compete with the Go George bus service in that area. Kodeta is also recruiting members and applying for new association to be registered in Bitu, Plettenberg Bay. So what are the root causes of these conflicts? We've seen that thread now. Predominantly the mother bodies are involved, Kata, Kodeta, and to some extent Ungedo as well. But the root causes, to put it plainly, is weak planning and regulations. We have to look at ourselves first and what it is that we can improve. Here, we have to admit that we had archaic systems, we had weak data, there's overtrading and reactive regulation. Corruption, of course, is also a problem within our own ranks as government. Flawed enforcement. Very often there's complicity when it comes to enforcement. The taxi mother bodies are actively recruiting police officers and traffic officers so that they've got information on where roadblocks are going to happen, etc. There's also an abdication of responsibility. Siloed data makes it very difficult for enforcement to be effective. Favoritism. Organized crime. We've got to call it for what it is. It's not a public transport issue when someone commits murder. There's extortion, racketeering, assassinations, intimidation, gangs, and all of it comes back to patriarchy. Whoever controls the most route is best placed to dispense patriarchy. And of course, there's been a fragmented response in response to the organized crime. But I'll come to what it is that is being done effectively to turn this around. Then there's simply greed on the part of the taxi leadership, gatekeeping, taxation, reckless recruitment. When routes are overtraded, that leads to violence. But the leadership, the leaders of the route associations and the mother bodies and regions also continue recruiting because they get paid big money by individuals who wish to operate taxis. Perhaps take their pension payout, go and buy a taxi, and then hope to be able to operate illegally. And then, of course, the leaders themselves become targets when those taxis are impounded by enforcement authorities. Leadership battles themselves are a cause of violence. It's no coincidence that most of the killings, if we look at the trend, many of the killings happen closer to minibus taxi council elections. And then lastly, what I call a culture of lawlessness within the minibus taxi industry. There's entitlement. The employment conditions of drivers is very often a cause for the violence. When drivers are not paid what they're supposed to be paid, the labor legislation does not seem to apply to the minibus taxi industry, and Minister Madikizela has taken them on. He's put it to them that they have to change that. When the drivers blockaded the N2, the leadership of the minibus taxi industry said, but we had nothing to do with it. But these drivers were the employees, and that is where Minister said that has to be addressed, because the taxi leadership was abdicating that responsibility. And also a lack of training, the fear and the captive market that they have or that they wish to establish. So what have we done with regards to weak planning and regulation, and what are we doing? Minister Madikizela has asked us to arrange a planning in Daba, and unfortunately that was overtaken by lockdown. Our department, another branch of our department, is reviewing all of the municipal ITPs to reassess supply and demand, because the taxi industry is arguing that their members who are operating illegally are there merely to provide a service because the demand is there. So we've said we'll now look into that and call all of the planning authorities together and assess their integrated transport plans. If there is additional demand, then there will be a special legalization process that the PRE will implement. Provincial legislation is being drafted to fill the gaps in national legislation. And we have the Western Cape Transport Framework Bill, and Advocate Reina can correct me if I'm wrong there, that introduces driver registration, makes it compulsory for driver registration, and also stipulates standard operating license conditions that will be applied to all operating licenses. Very importantly, Chair, last year we introduced what I call a game changer in going live with the public transport regulation system. Up to October last year, all provinces were dependent on the National Department of Transport for an archaic system that was not really able to meet the demands of being a transactional system that could take an application from the payment of the application fee to the issuing of the operating license. The Western Cape embarked on this process about 3-4 years ago. In October last year, we went live, and this system has changed the game because it's integrated, and you can see a couple of the screenshots on the right-hand side of the screen. PTRS also integrates planning, survey, and operating license data. We've worked very, very closely with the City of Cape Town, who also started to develop a system for transport regulation, and we've worked in partnership with the city. Then one of our departments, our branches, flagship projects is, of course, the Transport Intelligence Center, and I'm sure the members have been informed of the Transport Hub, and this system is definitely linked into the hub. In addressing weak planning and regulation also, the PRE specifically has gone around to municipalities and offered capacity building and training for their planners in operating license management and also planning for public transport, how to monitor supply and demand. Just a few more screenshots on the system that we've introduced. This is what it looked like before on the left-hand side. Really archaic, different menus that were not really very flexible. The system on the right-hand side, a couple of the screenshots, just much more user-friendly, and of course it allows us to identify some of the flaws that the old system actually supported. An argument that is put forward by the industry is that they are waiting for operating licenses, that the PRE is taking long, that my vehicle should not be impounded because I applied 3 years ago or a year ago for an operating license. I want to dispel that immediately. This was drawn from our system. Mr. Skriker made this information available. And as you can see, in 2019, 99% of applications that were submitted to the provincial regulatory entity were finalized within 60 days. We are allowed 90 days, Chair. And there's constant improvement in this regard. So that argument does not hold water. There are no backlogs. Everyone who should have an operating license by now does have one, or the operating license simply was not supported by the planning authority. If we look at flawed enforcement, what it is that we're doing there, constant training for traffic authorities and the police, and information sharing on transport regulations and operating license conditions. We've improved processes with the SAPS to check criminal records before a person is issued with an operating license. The Transport Intelligence Center I've already mentioned. Stolen vehicles even can be identified through the automatic number plate recognition cameras that we've introduced. And the same system can allow us now to identify where taxis are operating on routes where they are not supposed to be or where they are not authorized to be. And also in terms of enforcement, of course, is the enforcement of labor legislation. And here is where we are looking to a partnership with the Department of Labor to firstly conscientize the industry, the drivers themselves, on what rights they have. Just some photos of a training session that Mr. Skricker and Ms. McMahon and their colleagues provided to traffic officers. I think this was in the Garden Route area. Organized crime is a difficult one because here I must firstly say that the police over the last couple of months, last year and a bit, have done excellent work. We have in this province a well-functioning Transport Priority Committee, which is a priority committee of the Prof joints. Our department co-chairs, I'm co-chair with Brigadier Zandberg and General Manki. A joint task team on taxi-related crimes was established between the SAPS, the National Prosecuting Authority, our department, the SSA, SARS, the Revenue Service, and Community Safety. Taxi-related crimes were formally identified and defined and adopted by the Prof joints. So not just murders and attempted murders, extortion, threatening behavior by taxi associations have been defined as taxi-related crimes and can now be investigated by a dedicated team of detectives assigned to investigate all taxi-related murders and hits and taxi-related crimes. And the impact of this, Chair, I will come to shortly. Importantly, there is now a single repository of all taxi-related crimes established and jointly updated by the SAPS and the National Prosecuting Authorities and ourselves, where we are able to now start to connect the dots between cases in various precincts or clusters. And also, there is a dedicated reporting line for taxi-related violence and incidents that the industry can use and also commuters. I want to go through one case study of how SAPS, in partnership with a number of role players, were able to connect the dots. There was a case in Stellenbosch of unlawful possession of firearms and ammunition. A cache was found that could be linked to a case, a murder case in Delft and another murder case in Hout Bay. Now, previously, all three of these cases, these three cases would have been dealt with separately. But the linkages were quickly found because there was a single repository established and a single team, small team of dedicated detectives investigated it. And that investigation led to a Mr. Pendile Velem. I can mention his name because he was found guilty. And he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the two murders and 15 years for the firearms, unlawful possession of firearms. Very importantly, Chair, as Minister Madikizela calls it, he now hopefully will lead us to the paymasters. My apology for the misspelling there. And this is important for us to get to the paymasters, not just the hitmen. The hitmen are dime a dozen, but the police want to get, and we need them to get to the paymasters. Then I want to touch on the greed. We start at the association level. The vying for leadership positions lead to murders at times. It's that extreme because the leaders have got, again, they hold the strings for dispensing patriarchy. They can decide who becomes a member. They can decide who is supported for an operating license. And it starts there with monitoring the annual general meetings of taxi associations, including the audited financial statements. There's still a challenge there. Independent electoral monitors are appointed by our department to supervise regional and provincial taxi council elections, training in and enforcement of codes of conduct for minibus taxi associations and operators. That's driven by the registrar and the PRE. We have a partnership with the Department of Labor to monitor the working conditions of drivers and other employees, and also tracking the hiring of permits or operating licenses by gatekeeping executives through changes in vehicle ownership. And our new system, and Bernie can attest to this, our new system now allows us to do that because allows us now to integrate also with NATIS. Let me just explain that. A taxi association will support an operating license for a driver, but the vehicle will then be transferred to someone else, and the driver will then go and apply for a second issue of the operating license, and then say the operating license was misplaced or it was stolen. And then the second operating license is issued, but then we have two vehicles operating with two operating licenses that were issued. We're also looking now to strengthen our partnership with SARS to track the flow of money. These are some of the receipts issued by these associations when they actually extort money from people. Coming now to the culture of lawlessness, as I call it, we address that by registering drivers. Drivers carry the minibus taxi industry. The owners very often are not even in this province. They rely on the drivers to manage the business and to simply give them a daily target that has to be reached. And very often drivers are extremely unhappy when fines are issued, of course, to them, because the owners will simply say to them, you have to pay the fines. When tires have to replace, that's the driver's responsibility. So the driver employment conditions often also would lead to conflict within associations. The system for registering drivers is now being developed, and we've also changed our approach, Chair, looking at incentivizing compliance by associations through tracking and contracted services like the red dot service that you may have heard of, or the blue dot service that's currently under development that my colleague Deirdre, who's in this meeting, either has told you about already or can tell you more about. We're also reviewing regulations for vehicle marking or identification system and introducing tracking and other technology to curtail route invasions. Within the City of Cape Town, we've requested a task team on rank management to be established to take back control of ranks from taxi associations. Also introducing technology that will allow only legal taxis to enter the rank, so that we can stop patrol vehicles and enforcers who are extorting money from operators, legal operators as well as illegal operators. And then again, looking to ourselves, rooting out fraud and corruption within our own ranks, within the licensing, that's the vehicle as well as operating license environments. I want to quickly touch on minibus taxi ranks and interchanges. Taxi associations and leaders see taxi ranks as their turf, just like gangs see certain townships as their turfs, over which they exercise absolute control. So operators, legal and illegal, informal traders, and even private companies are having to pay fees to taxi leaders or gangsters at ranks. There's poor integration for the management of interchanges, specifically on process sites where you have a station involved. Very poor integration between the management of the facilities. The rank managers and security staff are ill-equipped to maintain order and are afraid to engage taxi bosses who break the law. Informal or illegal taxi ranks are very easily established by both legal and illegal operators. And very often at these illegally established ranks is where you find the violence erupting between the legal operators and the illegal operators. There are uncoordinated efforts and no effective communication between municipal departments, other government stakeholders and contractors, such as security companies and EPWP workers who are employed to clean the ranks, for instance. Many facilities are in shocking states, impacting also on the dignity of commuters, I must emphasize. I wanted to show you how difficult it is to identify fraud in this environment. One of these operating licenses is a fraudulent one. It's not easy to pick out because both of these, in fact, were printed on original face value forms. That's that green form, which have got security features in. But when a face value form is stolen in Limpopo and finds its way to the Western Cape, a syndicate isn't able to produce these operating licenses that look genuine, but one is fake. So you can understand, Chair, how difficult it is for a traffic officer or a police officer at 11 o'clock at night to be able to pick out the the fraudulent one. So it is a sophisticated operation to issue these fraudulent operating licenses, and it is part of organized crime. This one, however, is not that sophisticated because all of the details show that these are two different operating licenses, but same issue number for the face value form. So this is simply a photocopy, not a stolen one. But again, these are, with color copies, it's very difficult to identify which one is in fact real, if any of the two are in fact genuine. And then of course you do get the less sophisticated attempts at fraudulent licenses where they just use a Vodacom thing and put it on a round sticker and hope that the police will not stop them and check the operating license. Lastly, Chair, just a few additional interventions that we are now also pushing as a department with Minister Madigizela, our department officials and the city officials. We regularly meet with Santaco, Kata and Kodeta leadership. Minister mentioned it at the beginning of the meeting. As late as last week, we had an engagement with the leadership to put them to task, to say to them that they have a responsibility to also point to who the killers are within their ranks. We provide administrative assistance to Santaco in the Western Cape so that they are able to play a leadership role and not have to worry about their businesses that still need to be managed. So we have a financial agreement to support the provincial and regional executives with logistics, with travel and meeting allowances. We do, Minister has done many visits to ranks and interchanges to directly engage operators and drivers. Bernie has gone with myself and many of our other officials have gone to the ranks. PPE distribution during this time of COVID in support of compliance with the regulations. We've done at the ranks in partnership with Santaco. We have daily cooperative engagements with the SAPS to help with information that they require for investigating these crimes that are committed in the names of the taxi industry. And we do have a team of independent mediators on call for the industry to resolve their disputes before these disputes spill over into violent conflict. And we have more murders and attempted murders adding to the statistics on taxi-related crimes. Chair, that's my presentation. We'll take the questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed, for the presentation. Members, I'm going to now open the floor for discussions. If you can just give me an indication of who would have questions, just so that I acknowledge you in a certain order. I see Honourable America, Honourable Heron, Honourable Mvimbi, Honourable van der Westhuizen. Okay, members, can I please ask that you get straight to your questions because we have time constraints, but I also don't want to limit this engagement because it's a very important topic for discussion. So, Honourable America.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, my heart goes out to our law enforcement officials who have to enforce the regulations that exist, and because what we've heard this afternoon is, and the Minister has indicated, many of these things are historical. It's comes a long way, and it is not a Western Cape problem, it's a national problem that we are facing, because the problems that we may be facing are similar to those faced by other provinces. Now, it's commendable to hear the kinds of interventions that the department makes in mitigating the conflict that ever so perpetually presents itself in the provinces. And my question, and I have quite a few, but I'll try to limit them as far as I can, is that one, because it's a national problem, is what assistance does the provincial department get from the national department in terms of assisting us in dealing with the kind of problems that we have. And then also secondly, there are references made in terms of resolving disputes by means of arbitration. My question is, how committed are the parties when a dispute is arbitrated to abide by the outcome of the arbitration order? And if a party do not comply with those order, what sanctions are there to institute against such a party? And so some of my colleagues may also speak about the subsidies that may assist us in addressing some of the problems that we have. Although it may be a welcome and necessary measure, what I've listened today is that subsidies on its own to taxi owners will not address the inherent conflict that exists within the industry. Much more needs to be done, and the provincial department, as much as they possibly can do, can only address this effectively with the assistance of the national department. Then furthermore, Chairperson, in terms of the statistics and the convictions and the murders, does the department have, in cooperation with community safety, perhaps have a watching brief in terms of, in the rare instance where these hired guns are apprehended, the case flow and follow it to its conclusion? And also it's mentioned that labor legislation and this cooperation between the department and the Department of Labor. It's a mistaken belief that drivers and gauchos, as they are known, fall outside of the labor relations parameters. In fact, if you look at the definition of what an employee is, that many of them are employees, and they do fall within the ambit of the labor relations regime. But I can understand that because of fear that they do not want to enforce that status that they may have. And the question is that we often hear labor inspectors visiting workplaces for compliance with legislation. I've never heard and witnessed labor inspectors enforcing labor legislation within the industry. To what extent does the department bring that to the attention of the Department of Labor, that these labor inspectors need to do their job? And lastly, Chair, is that how far are we with a single transferable ticketing system? Because if we take the cash out of the system, that may also sort of, to an extent, contribute to the alleviation of the conflict or the problem that we may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable America. Mr. Ahmed, I'm going to take one round of questions, if that's in order with you, or you must indicate to me if you would like to respond when it gets too much.
Chair, no, you can take the questions. I am taking notes, and then we can answer in one go.
All right, thank you. Honourable Aaron.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think my first question is really around the supply and demand, because I think that's probably where most of the conflict resides. And I'm interested to know what the department intends with its meeting with the planning authorities to assess the ITPs and the supply and demand in those ITPs, What are they hoping to get out of that, and are they intending to ask planning authorities to make amendments? Because the ITPs are all approved by the MEC before they are actually formally approved. So I'm just wondering what has changed in the supply and demand space that requires that meeting and requires the department to assess municipalities' supply and demand in ITPs. Then I'm also, on the same topic, interested in the legislation and what is the intention there with regards to supply and demand. And then if I can go to the hotspots and the recent conflict in various parts of our province. And in particular, about a week or so ago, I received information that in George, for George, the PRE had approved 51 operating licenses for Unledo, and this is causing a lot of conflict and tension in the George area. And it appears to arise out of an agreement between the department and the municipality to pacify Unledo as the Go George is rolled out. So I wonder if we can get some information on what is going on in George. Why was Unledo kind of favored with this opening of the moratorium to allow for license applications, and none of the other operators or the other taxi associations were permitted to also apply? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. Honourable Mvimbi. Honourable Mvimbi, I think you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now, Chairperson?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Now, without making any preamble to my questions, Chairperson, I just want to latch on the previous question on ITPs. I believe that ITPs is the responsibility of the municipalities, and to what extent is there a relationship between the provincial government and municipalities, and maybe how are the municipalities progressing in terms of establishing these ITPs, because I think they can really also go a long way in terms of assisting us in terms of addressing some of our integrated transport problems. But also, Chair, mindful to also say that this is very, very helpful and been an eye-opener to me, this presentation on many things. Now, I see on the presentation when it comes to taxi hotspots, I think when it comes to mother bodies, I see there's mother bodies that are being referred to in inverted commas. Is it because they are recognized or they are not being recognized? And especially, I see also there are, so what was really what are those that are recognized? What are those that are not being recognized in view of the inverted commas that have been put on these mother bodies? Now, and maybe also I just wanted to check now, one of the things that has been a bit also disarming to me, the admission on the fact that there are weaknesses on some of the root causes, the weaknesses in regulation, flow enforcement, and lawlessness. Now, one of the issues in terms of dealing with some of these causes is to do training, but I see this training seems to be only for law enforcement officers. Are there any training that is being given to taxi operators and to drivers as well? Because I think some of these things might also go a long way in terms of actually assisting some of these operators and taxi drivers with training. The second last question, Chairperson, is on the issue of taxi rank. You know, most of the problems you'll find that are really created, and most of lawlessness happens at taxi ranks. But you'll find that there seem to be a lot of law enforcement on taxi rank that are in town as compared to taxi rank that are operating in the township. If you go to Guguletu, especially during the pickup hour, it's a nightmare to try and drive there when you are just a normal driver, not a taxi, because of the lack of lawlessness in the township areas. Because they know that maybe even if the minister sometimes visits, they know he will visit on certain times, but there's not going to be constant visibility of law enforcement right through. And I think maybe to what is really being done to ensure that there is visible law enforcement that is taking place right through, not on certain times of the day. And then also the issue, if we can really work, I'm glad that we are also considering on the issue of the conditions of this taxi rank, because sometimes these conditions also do contribute to the state of lawlessness that is actually taking place there. I think let me stop there, Chairperson.
All right, thank you, Honourable Mvimbi. Mr. Ahmed, I think that's the round.
No, Van der Westhuizen.
My apologies, Honourable Van der Westhuizen. I don't know, I couldn't see your hand. Over to you.
Recognize me. I just lowered my hand once you recognized me. Sorry. Thank you, Chair. Chair, just a number of questions. And the first one, and I first want to acknowledge, I know very little. And I was hoping that Honourable Mvimbi would be the one saying, yeah, you know, he knows a lot. But the question that I would like us to answer at the end of the session is, what can we do to assist? Because I think we will all agree as members of this committee that it's a completely unacceptable situation that we are experiencing. And the fact that other provinces may have the same problem, etc., it doesn't justify it. It's unacceptable. Taxis are just too important a service in the South African context and in the wider context even. So something must happen. And I want to link on to a number of my colleagues. The first one is Honourable Heron regarding the research. I really want to ask, you know, do we have the necessary research? And you know the word intelligence, where it's being used in many of these environments. Do we have the necessary research and intelligence capacity? And what can we do, if not, to build onto that? The second one is also in other environments, they talk about the broken window syndrome, or the, you know, if you want to bring down crime, you must start fixing the windows in the street. And my question is, to what extent can we improve the situation by general traffic law enforcement? We all know traffic's jumping red lights. We all know traffic's come past us in the yellow lane, in the rush hours on our highways, and so on. And you know, I know sometimes they claim that the traffic officers are targeting them, but all in all, I think the image of the taxi industry is one of lawlessness. And I'm just wondering whether, if we start kind of attending to their windows and applying the traffic laws, whether it won't spill over into, you know, adherence to route licenses and things like that. Then the next question, Chair, is also mediation. My experience has been, and feedback from mediators, is that they can only mediate if they know that the end result for both parties, if they don't come to an agreement, would be worse than without the mediation. And my question is just, to what extent can we, when mediation failed, hit the mother associations or touch their pockets or something like that? And then, Chair, I also would like to know, you know, I know sometimes taxis are being impounded, etc. At what stage do you get to that? Because I must say, on the one hand, if that's my asset and it gets impounded, I will also tend to get my blood pressure up and respond, perhaps not with the violence that we have seen, but you know, if you depend on that as your source of income and it gets impounded, on the other hand, if that is the only way in which to get people eventually to come and settle their fines, then let it be. But if you could just tell us what do you do in that regard? And lastly, it seems to me we're talking about extortion here. I do know in the case of Themba Letu, if you, a bus operator that wants to take people, let's say, for example, from George to Oudtshoorn or a neighboring town, you must pay the local taxi association of Themba Letu 1,000+ rand just to be allowed to pick up passengers in Thembalethu. Now, if this, do they have the right to kind of impose these fees? And if not, should we get a case of extortion? But I also know that in this country, you know, there are some big fish walking around free after corrupt activities and so on. And obviously, if we don't have the law enforcement processes in place, then you know, I understand how difficult it must be for you as provincial transport officials. So, Chair, just to come back where I started off, what can we do as a provincial parliament to strengthen your hands and to get back to law and order in terms of our public transport system? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable van der Westhuizen. Mr. Ahmed, that's the round.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the members for very, very good questions. Let me start with Member America's question. Member America is right when he said that this is a problem that's not unique to the Western Cape or the city of Cape Town area. It is a national problem. So you have, for instance, in Gauteng right now, as we speak, there is a commission of inquiry into taxi violence in Gauteng. I doubt very much that they're going to find causes different or very different from what I've presented to you today, because you've got very similar root causes to the violence there, perhaps at a much bigger scale. But in answer to the first question by Member America, there's really not much that the National Department of Transport can do, because their role, the National Department's role and the National Minister's role, is defined in legislation, and that is to set in place the policies. And I must admit that very often when the National Department and our colleagues from National Department get involved, it ends up exacerbating the problem rather than solving the problems. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to enforcement and educating enforcement authorities as well as the operators themselves. And of course, just making sure that the regulatory environment is running smoothly. With regards to arbitration, Member America asked about the arbitration. How committed are the parties to the process? Unfortunately, we have found that parties will agree upfront to abide by the outcome of mediation, and they will perhaps abide by the decisions. They'll come to some sort of agreement to share routes, etc. But unless it is founded in legislation, unless the operating licenses are changed, these informal agreements between operators never last. Even when we have arbitration, this was the very first case where the department, in fact, went and supported two associations going to arbitration. We were very realistic and said that if needs be, we will approach the court for a declaratory order so that the arbitrator's findings, in fact, can become an order of the court. So that is, in fact, where we are at now with the arbitration process that we had in Bellville. So yes, in short, the process itself leads to some calming of the violence. So that in itself is a big plus, but it really depends on the parties involved in the mediation process, whether they will honor the decisions that are taken during the mediation process. Then Member America asked a question with regards to subsidies. Now, that is something that can be addressed at the national level, because very honestly, there just is not enough money for the subsidized services across the country. And National Treasury has made that very clear, and the National Department of Transport, its hands are tied. But the approach that we want to take in this province is slightly different. We're looking at, I've mentioned the blue dot and the red dot, and my colleagues can come in here if they want to add, but we're looking at not subsidizing, but incentivizing. Incentivizing operators in a way that they will want to operate better, and offer better services. And we incentivize that good behavior on the part of the drivers and the owners and the associations. So that starts with tracking the vehicles to see how the vehicle is what speed it is driving at, whether it is sticking to its route, etc. But in short, subsidy, I have to agree with Member America, is not the answer, the be-all and end-all to stop the taxi violence. It does come down to the individual operators and their behavior and how we can incentivize them. With regards to the watching brief, I'm going to take a step back because I did mention that there is currently a very good working relationship between the SAPS and ourselves as a department and the National Prosecuting Authority. So when there is an arrest, in the case of a confirmed taxi-related crime, the National Prosecuting Authority at the highest level in the province is informed of that arrest. And the first step is that bail will be opposed. And then through the process that we have, through the weekly engagements that we as a department have with the SAPS and the National Prosecuting Authority, with community safety now also, we then follow each one of those cases. And the case study that I've shown you of Pendile Vellum, we followed that right through. First, it connected the different cases, found who the common thread was that ran through it, and that was in effect a watching brief right up to the conviction. Then labor legislation, Member America is absolutely right. Drivers and gachis, they are covered by labor legislation. In fact, Member America, I'm not sure if you're aware that there is in fact a sectoral determination for minibus taxi drivers and guards or employees in the minibus taxi industry. The challenge, though, is that there's a lot of misconception within the minibus taxi industry by the employees of what a minimum wage will mean for them. Because you see, many drivers are appointed on the basis of a daily target. And then everything that you make beyond that daily target, that's yours. Now that touches on another question that was asked by Member van der Westhuizen about the behavior of drivers, because they will drive like maniacs in the morning to make that target in the morning, so that by the evening they start earning money for themselves. And some of them can make good money depending on the route and depending on how they drive. But for that reason, there's been a reluctance by many drivers to actually just accept that they can hold their employers to abiding by labor legislation. And that requires from our side as government. And the question that Member van der Westhuizen asked, what it is that you as members can do, is to dispel that misinformation that there is within the industry, specifically within the minds of drivers, that they have got rights as employees, firstly, to a decent wage to be paid by the taxi owners to them. We've made it part of the operating license condition. In fact, when someone applies for an operating license, there is a form that must be filled in to say that I will abide by labor legislation. So if someone does not abide by labor legislation, if a driver comes to us and says that the owner of this taxi does not abide by labor legislation, that gives the PRE grounds to withdraw that operating license. But there's no driver who would do that, because they see the opportunity to actually make more money than what the minimum wage is as set in that sectoral determination. The single transferable ticketing system, Member America, I'm going to ask Chair, with your indulgence, if we can park that discussion, because that, I think, requires a much more broader discussion around public transport planning and what it is that the municipality, specifically the City of Cape Town, is doing from their side to look at integrated ticketing. We've done some good work, and again here my colleague Deirdre Rubenaar in George with the Go George project, with the integrated fare management and with technology that has been introduced. But I would suggest perhaps that would be a topic for discussion at a separate session, because once I get going on that, you may not be able to stop me.
Yassir, sorry,
yeah.
Yassir, can I just come in there quickly with regards to the integrated ticketing system? Just to add that there's an intermodal planning committee that's under the auspices of the city, and there are various subcommittees. One of the subcommittees is the bus subcommittee, and that this issue is squarely on the agenda of the bus subsidy committee on how we get one integrated ticketing system within the province. So it is work underway, and discussions are happening between the city and ourselves.
Thank you, Advocate Reyneke. Moving now to Member Heron's questions. Firstly, with regards to supply and demand, what is the intention behind assessing the integrated transport plans? Now, Mr. Heron, you can understand that the City of Cape Town's integrated transport plan is well thought out. It is solid. We're talking about all of the integrated transport plans of all of the municipalities. Now, in answer to one of the other questions, our department does provide assistance to every municipality to prepare these transport plans. So we don't just leave it to the municipalities as planning authorities, leave them to their own devices. When we say that our department will now work with municipalities to assess their ITPs, we will look at the survey data that they have. We will look at traffic volumes, at developments within that area, and try to some extent to come up with answers to the taxi industry in those areas who are saying that there is additional demand, even if it means that we can just dispel that argument to say that the current supply of operating licenses, in fact, does meet the demand for public transport services. But it is just working with those municipalities, because what we also find that when it comes to municipalities other than the City of Cape Town, you very often have the planners drawing up the ITP, but when it comes to commenting or providing the directives to the PRE, we still have, in some cases, traffic officers providing that those directives. So there is that disjoint, this juncture between the various units within municipalities that we also want to address. It's not just looking at the integrated transport plans. You've mentioned, George, the PRE.
Sorry, yes, here. Can I also come in on the integrated transport plans? Apologies for just coming in there. Okay. I think also I just wanted to as I understand Member Heron's question is that our MEC also has the power to approve the ITPs, and he would like to hear a bit more about sort of the approval of the ITPs and the sort of supply and demand issues relating to that. So if we look at Section 36 of the National Land Transport Act, the MEC's approval can only relate to some things: monitoring and compliance of land transport frameworks, procedural and financial issues that affect the province, and so forth. So, so there are very limited things that the MEC can approve the ITP in respect of. So the supply and demand issue was always an issue that when the NLTA was designed, was supposed to be squarely with the municipalities itself. However, if you look at Section 36 of the NLTA, it says that our MEC can approve ITPs in respect of all these issues, but then the final caveat of that section is any other matter provided in provincial laws. And this is the question, then this brings us back to the question of legislation. So what we are currently looking at, and by no means it's a finalized product, we are looking at what are those other things in provincial laws that an ITP has to adhere to before our MEC approves. So some of that could be, and some of that is under discussion could be, number one, the principle of regional integration, for example. In other words, municipalities that have common boundaries. So what are the rules when we talk about ITPs, and how do we ensure that there is integration and alignment between neighboring municipalities? That are some of the things that are being considered. Other things that are being considered is the establishment of an integrated steering committee at provincial level, by which this ITP would then pass first, and that integrated steering committee then would make recommendations to the MEC before such approval, and that will be potentially in legislation. Other things would also be to ensure that if we have provincial strategic objectives, that the provincial strategic objectives are adhered to by municipalities in ITPs and so forth. And obviously some of the issues may be related to demand and supply, our provincial objectives. And so these are the things under discussion, but it's by no means a completed work. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Advocate Reyneke. Member Heeren, with regards to the George operating licenses, the PRE, yes, did approve operating licenses, a number of operating licenses for UNEDO operators who are registered with UNEDO. It was not to appease anyone. I want to emphasize again what I said earlier on during the presentation. The PRE will only issue operating licenses on the directive of the planning authority. Now, the Go George service does, of course, cover a number of routes in the area. There have been developments in George, and the additional operating licenses were supported by the George municipality as the planning authority. There were objections that were lodged by a group of drivers who aligned themselves to CODETA. And as I mentioned during the presentation, CODETA is trying to establish a presence and a foothold in the garden route. So they are supporting these drivers who have been operating illegally, and supporting them to and objected to these operating licenses. But the operating licenses were issued to UNEDO operators who have got those routes registered against that association. Member Mvimbi, you're right, ITPs are the responsibility of municipalities, and you asked how municipalities are progressing. I think Advocate Reyneke explained now what it is that is happening with regards to assessing the ITPs and how that process is going to unfold going forward, so that we can also strengthen and improve the quality of ITPs. I must mention that in other parts of the country, there are some municipalities that have not produced ITPs for years. In fact, we have been invited, the Western Cape PRE was invited to Gauteng to do training there of their PRE, and to assist with backlogs that they had. And we found that most of the municipalities in Gauteng, in fact, did not have integrated transport plans in place. I mentioned earlier on that our department does assist municipalities with resources, and that would be in the form of either funding so that they appoint transport planners and consultants to draw up the plans for them, or in some cases, I think we also appoint the consultants to work with the municipalities. The issue of mother bodies, I put mother bodies in inverted commas on purpose, because SANTACO, the South African National Taxi Council, has a constitution, and that constitution defines route associations or local taxi associations, regional taxi associations, provincial taxi councils, and SANTACO, the South African National Taxi Council. Nowhere in the SANTACO constitution is there made mention of mother bodies. It is only in the Western Cape where mother bodies persist. The challenge that we have is that while the SANTACO constitution defines regions within geographic areas, what's happened with mother bodies in the Western Cape, the provincial council here adopted their own provincial constitution, which now brings into play mother bodies. But these mother bodies go and recruit route associations in geographic regions throughout the province. And as you would have seen in the presentation, in areas like Ceres, Grabouw, George, these regions of SANTACO are helpless when a mother body moves into the area and registers an association. So that is something that we now as a department that we are looking at with legal services to see whether we can get clarity either from SANTACO national office, and we have written to SANTACO at the national level to get their position. Informally, in discussions that I had with the leadership of SANTACO at the national level, they've said they do not recognize mother bodies. It is only here in the Western Cape where mother bodies actually exist, and the mother bodies also define themselves as regions, but regions that can recruit in other geographic regions. So there is a principal issue that needs to be clarified, and if it needs to be cleared up in a court of law, then that is a route that we will follow. So yes, mother bodies I did put into inverted commas for a particular reason. A weakness in the regulation. Mr. Member Mvimbi, the PRE, I did mention the PRE does regular training with enforcement authorities and with municipalities. Yes, they actually do have training sessions with operators and drivers also. And in fact, our PRE has developed a standard operating procedure for all of the application processes. And we've made this available to all of the taxi operators so that there is transparency in how we deal with applications for operating licenses. And if they have questions, Bernie and her team are always ready to go and do training, and so is Mark, with taxi associations that request training for their members. And we can provide photos and reports on training that has taken place with operators and associations over the last couple of years. Member Mvimbi also pointed out rightly that most problems occur at ranks where these mini disputes happen, and very often these disputes spill over into violent conflict. The task team that has been established flowing from the Nsebeza Commission of Inquiry recommendations is looking exactly at that, at how the management of taxi ranks can be taken back by authorities, and that we do not have the taxi associations running these taxi ranks. Because as Member Mvimbi, as you pointed out, if you go into the townships, the taxi ranks in the townships are managed by the taxi industry. In Khayelitsha, Codeta runs it. And if the municipality will take responsibility for the infrastructure, but the management of the rank is very often left to the taxi associations, and that is where they have leverage to collect all types of fees from operators, the daily fees that they actually charge taxi operators and drivers for the right to operate from those ranks. So yes, that is something that the task team now is looking at and how that can be rectified. Member van der Westhuizen, your question with regards to the intelligence, absolutely right. And I did mention the transport hub, and this is the essence of the transport hub, which is a flagship project of our department. And Advocate Reinach is really the driver behind that. it's pulling together all of the various strands of information or pockets of information that we have in various systems, starting with NATIS, the vehicle and driver information, and then pulling information from automatic number plate recognition cameras that are all over the place, and entering into partnerships with municipalities, neighborhood watches that have got these cameras, but pulling all of that information and data into a central hub where the data can be analyzed and then pushed out again to enforcement officers as intelligence that they can use to more effectively enforce the law. That's the essence of the Transport Hub initiative as I see it. I totally understand the broken windows syndrome and the approach that was taken in New York when I read about it. And here again, I'm going to fall back on the point that I made with regards to us wanting to incentivize good behavior on the part of operators and drivers and associations, and looking at the employment conditions of drivers in the process. And the Blue Dot initiative that's currently under development by Deirdre and her team seeks to do just that, not just to enforce the law so that we change behavior through enforcement, but changing behavior also through behavioral economics and incentivizing a change in behavior for the better of the operators, but ultimately also for improving the public transport experience of commuters and users of public transport. The mediators, Member van der Westhuizen, that we have on board, the team of mediators led by Dr. Eldred de Klerk, follow a particular process. They are well-seasoned mediators. They will enter into a compact with the parties upfront, get their buy-in to the process upfront, and there's a particular approach that they follow. We will not appoint mediators if the mediating team is not acceptable to both parties. And in the process, we then want the parties to agree to whatever the mediators process through that process to come up with a workable solution that will stop the violence. The impoundment of taxis is a last resort, but Member van der Westhuizen must understand that the impoundment is only really done in cases of taxis operating illegally. In other words, if the taxi doesn't have an operating license, or if it is operating on someone else's route. Because if a taxi with an operating license operates on somebody else's route, it will ultimately it will lead to violence. So if a codated taxi, for instance, operates on a Kata route, that is a recipe for conflict. So impoundment is done in those cases where there are no operating licenses and where a taxi operates on a route other than one for which it has authority. Now, the National Land Transport Act did away with what the preceding act allowed, and that was for forfeiture of a taxi in the event of someone habitually operating illegally and having the vehicle impounded once, twice, thrice. Thereafter, the vehicle would be forfeited to the state. And that was allowed for even in previous legislation, like the Land Transport Act, 1974. But the National Land Transport Act, the new National Land Transport Act, does not make allowance for forfeiture. And perhaps there is an argument to be made that these taxi operators are desperate to operate, and they will pay to have the vehicle released, even though it is a substantial amount for as a release fee that needs to be paid to get the vehicle out. Extortion, you're absolutely right. Just today, again, I had a call from farmers in George who said that their vehicles were hijacked and rerouted to Tembaletu, where the buses they were extorted in effect. The police luckily intervened and the vehicles were released without charge, but it's happening all over the place. It goes back to the point that I made. The taxi associations believe that not just the taxi ranks, but the entire township or area that they serve belong to them, and they have the sole right to operate. There are newspaper articles today where Golden Arrow buses have been stoned. I forget the area now. Where Golden Arrow buses have been stoned because the taxis don't want them in that area. So that is something that needs to be dealt with, not by transport. These are criminal acts, and this is something that I drill in with the SAPS. Criminal acts must be treated as such and must be investigated by the SAPS. And on that, the approach that we've asked the SAPS to take now, and it is starting to take root, is to address these crimes in terms of POCA, the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. You can understand that many of these companies, private companies that pick up their staff in a township whose vehicles are hijacked, are too scared to lay a charge. And it is for that reason that we've asked the SAPS to look at this approach, the POCA approach, the Prevention of Organized Crime Act approach, to dealing with this cancer of extortion that, if unchecked, will lead to more and more cases of buses, private vehicles, company vehicles being hijacked and kept at ranks, only to be released when the extortion money is paid. So yes, it is something that we take very seriously, and with the SAPS, there's a particular approach that we're looking to follow now. Member van der Westhuizen, my apology. Just lastly, on that very important question that you asked, what can members do? I mentioned earlier on that what it is you can do, but also to support us when the legislation does come through, to change legislation, to introduce the driver registration and that type of thing, when the legislation comes through you. And also one thing I didn't mention, and that is the commuter's voice. As representatives of the citizens, you can be the commuter's voice and also take on the industry when they do not provide the service that the commuters deserve. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. Members, we have gone over the scheduled time for this meeting. However, I think it's important that we continue to have this discussion. And for that reason, if it's in order with all members concerned and with the officials and minister, that we continue this meeting until 4 o'clock for the latest. That being said, I'm not going to allow new questions, but if there's burning follow-up questions from members, I would like to provide members with an opportunity to pose those. And all new questions will then be put in writing to the department. Minister, I see your hand.
Yes, Chair. I actually have another meeting that I was supposed to be at 3:30 because I was told that this meeting will be 1.5 hours. So can I be excused, Chair? I mean, if there's a need, then the officials will remain.
That's in order, Minister. Is there any closing remark from your side that you would like to do before you leave?
Well, I think it's the same thing I said earlier, but perhaps maybe one or two things that I want to latch on. It's important. I mean, in terms of intergovernmental relations, to work very closely with our national counterparts. And I can say it here, Chair, that we have a fairly good relationship with the National Department. We engage robustly on issues that need concurrence. But I must say that where the support is needed, we work very well together. And of course, I mean, you've seen the challenges that you're facing in this industry. And what I've been trying to do really is to try and build a relationship so that even in instances where we have to come down heavily on the industry, they must understand that one, we are very keen to get this industry professionalized, because as you all know that almost 50% of the people who are using public transport in the Western Cape use this mode of transport. So it is a heartbeat, of our economy, but at the same time, it's very important for the safety of our commuters and our people, and that is why I spoke about the multi-pronged approach. We need to enforce the law, we need to build a relationship, but we also need to make sure that the industry itself provide the necessary leadership that is needed. So in those few words, Chair, I want to thank the team because if you look at the number of questions that have been asked around the planning authorities and the permits, these are ongoing discussions, especially on the issue of supply and demand, because we've got from time to time, Member Heron, as you would know, to really assess the issue of demand, given the fact that our rail transport has effectively collapsed. And if you base really your demand on the normal situation where rail is functioning fully, GAPS is functioning fully, you would have a situation where there are, other, people who are operating without operating licenses because they are servicing the demand, and you find that the planning authorities do not agree that there is a need for more operating licenses to be issued. So these are the issues that we are grappling with, but I'm sure we will find each other with municipalities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister. You are excused if you need to leave. Members, I'm going to allow you an opportunity to pose any follow-up questions. Please, no new questions. The new questions we'll put in writing to the department. Are there any burning follow-up questions? I see Honourable Mvimbi, Honourable Heron. Okay, Honourable Mvimbi.
Thanks, Chairperson. We would have maybe liked to hear, unless I did not hear, I think Honourable Van Vesthuizen asked a question around the issues of impounding and the action that are normally being taken by the departments, as the action that is being taken by the departments towards transgressors. But you'll find that some of the time, I would have loved to hear the response of the department on that, because that is sometimes also one of the root cause of the problems and the troubles between the taxi operators and the drivers together with the department or with the authorities, because they believe that that is a way of trying to stifle them in their business, because some of the fines that are being imposed on them makes it very difficult for them, once those fines are imposed on them, to re-establish themselves again into the business. I would have maybe liked to hear what was the department's response going to be on that, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Mvimbi. Honourable Heron.
Thanks, Chair. I want to go back to the supply and demand, and I'm still trying to understand whether the department is just intending to assess the municipalities and how they've kind of analyzed demand, or what methods they're using to analyze demand, or whether we're looking to completely change the supply and demand model. And I'm hoping it's the latter, because from my experience when I was in the city, when you did a demand assessment, when the city did a demand assessment, it was really an archaic system where employees had to go out at 4 or 5 in the morning and count the number of people standing in the queue at a track taxi rank. And that just doesn't seem like the approach we should be adopting in 2020. So, I mean, is there not a better model for managing supply and demand, where the taxi industry themselves are more proactive or more involved in determining the demand, and as government we're more involved in managing quality of service? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Heron. Honourable Van Vesthuizen, Honourable America, are there any follow-ups from your side? I didn't see your hand, but I don't want to do like I did in the previous round.
I'm good, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Honourable Van Vesthuizen.
Thank you, Honourable Mitchell. I think Honourable Mvimbi raised the one aspect, although it was referred to in the first response. But I do think some more information sharing with the committee might be to our benefit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ahmed, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. In response to Member Mvimbi, the impounding, I did mention earlier on that there are certain conditions under which enforcement authorities will impound a vehicle and not just simply issue a fine. They will impound a vehicle if the vehicle does not have an operating license at all, or if that vehicle is operating completely off-route. And I'm not talking here about taking a detour when there's been maybe a traffic incident or a crash. That's very often argued by the industry when they generalize like that. But there are specific conditions under which vehicles will be impounded. The release fees that are applied in those cases when a vehicle is impounded, it does step up. So for the first time a vehicle is impounded, the release fee will be a particular amount. And then the second time the vehicle is found to be operating illegally, that release fee will be slightly higher. And the third time again, slightly higher. Now, there have been arguments in the past by the industry that traffic authorities are not enforcing consistently. And again, this forms part of the training interventions that the PRE and the Registrar's Office embarked on some time ago, so that the traffic authorities, and I must emphasize, the enforcement is done by local or municipal traffic authorities. The training interventions were targeted at the municipal traffic authorities so that they could, for instance, learn how to read and interpret operating licenses. So that argument that was put forward by the industry that the traffic authorities didn't understand what their operations are about and where they are allowed to operate, etc., that could be addressed. And that has now been addressed, that traffic authorities, traffic officers can read the operating licenses, understand the route, and the system, the new system that we have, also is able to print out the route on a map so that officers can see when a taxi is operating off-route completely. So you find, for instance, that a taxi that has got an operating license that allows it to operate in Worcester is found to be operating in Paarl. I'm using a real life example now. That taxi is clearly operating off-route, although it has an operating license. It is now operating on the route of another association, which has led to conflict. And in that case, that taxi would then be subject to being impounded. Member Mvimbi, I hope I've answered that question. And as I said, that goes hand in hand with training officers so that we do not have situations where taxis are wrongfully impounded.
Thanks very much, through you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Member Mvimbi. Mr. Heron, the issue of supply and demand, I think Minister Madikizela raised a very important point that I did not mention. Of course, that is the issue of the collapse of rail, and how that has skewed supply and demand. And I have to agree with you that the model that was used historically for assessing supply and demand does need to be reviewed in itself. And I don't want to preempt that is what will come out of such an assessment process that we've embarked on now. But that may well be where we end up, where we completely review the process of how we assess supply and demand. The industry right now argue that people are waiting too long. So they use their own method of assessing supply and demand. But we have to balance the industry's assessment with what will impact on the economic viability of that operation. we can understand that commuters do not want to wait long in a queue before they get onto a public transport bus or a minibus. But we also, it is not viable to have thousands of minibuses standing for 80% of the day, not doing any work, because they're only looking at serving commuters during the peaks. And that ultimately leads to what I call an amapela situation, where operators are making a quick buck, but they are unable to maintain their vehicles, and eventually that vehicle then just becomes a death trap. That's also not going to be in the best interest of commuters. So in short, I do not want to preempt, Member Heron, what the outcome will be of the assessment process, but the point that you make is a very valid one, that we may want to completely overhaul the process that we've used in the past to assess supply and demand. Thank you, Chair.
Can I come in there, Yasir?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to add, and responding also directly to the question, it's a combination of sort of the process under which the city takes in order to collect the data and so forth. So we are, from a systematic perspective, looking at how we use our current technology to collect the data independently of a process where you have monitors standing, counting taxis and so forth. As you are aware, we have now geocoded in our system every single route, as Yasir said. And so you can just look at a particular route and look at all minibus taxis that operated on that route, if there are cameras available and so forth. We currently have about, I think we're on about 1,000 cameras reporting into our system, where we can see minibus taxis operating, and we plan to increase it and to start to talk to the City of Cape Town by looking at introducing technological means to determine how much vehicles are operating on the system and so forth. Also about the counting of people actually on and the movements of people. We are looking at technological issues to look at an easier way of determining supply and demand on particular routes. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that, as we spoke about the legislation, one of the regulations we'd like to introduce is that the provincial minister, which our MEC, may make regulations regarding the guidelines for establishing public transport networks, integrated public transport networks. And as part of that, to issue guidelines which ITPs have to comply with. It could also include guidelines with regards to supply and demand analyses and so forth, and very much working then in concert with the technology that we are sort of introducing going forward. But discussions have been had around that, and so we do intend to create rules and systems to try and improve sort of the way things are done currently.
Right, thank you very much for those answers. Members, it's now 6 minutes to 4. I'm going to ask, are there any members of the public that would like to ask a question on this topic? Can I please have an indication? All right, there's no indication that there's a member of the public that would like to ask questions. So I'm going to then use this opportunity, Mr. Ahmed, to you and the team. Thank you very much for the engagement today. Thank you for allowing us to ask the difficult questions. I'm sure that there's more questions that will come from the members, and those we will put in writing to the department. And I'm sure we will have this topic on the agenda soon, because it's broader than just what we have discussed today. So from my side, on behalf of the committee, thank you very, very much. Members, if you could please remain behind or online so that we can just deal with the administration. Mr. Ahmed, you and the officials are more than welcome to leave.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kutsia, can I please ask that you put the minutes on the screen so that we can just adopt those minutes?
Will do so, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Members, while that is happening, I'm going to ask that if you have any resolutions or requests for information emanating from this committee meeting, that you would please send those through to Mr. Kutsia, copied to myself, by close of business on Thursday, if that is enough time for everyone to just get the additional information and requests ready. All right, if you can start on the top, Mr. Kutsia. Can everyone see the minutes?
Yes, Chair.
All right, page 1 for the minutes of the 27th of July. Any edits or amendments? Page 2, any edits or amendments? If not, can I get a proposer or a seconder for those minutes?
Chair, I propose that we adopt minutes as presented to us.
Thank you very much, Honourable America.
Seconded.
And seconded by Honourable Mvimbi. Thank you very much, members. And then there's just one last set of minutes for adoption. Page 1 for the minutes of the 21st of July. My apologies. Page 1. Any edits or amendments? Page 2. Any edits or amendments? If no edits or amendments, I table the minutes of the 21st of July for adoption.
I propose.
Thank you, Honourable van der Westhuizen. Proposed by Honourable van der Westhuizen and seconded by Honourable America. Members, that brings us to the end of this committee meeting. As indicated, if you have any additional information you require, please do so in writing, emanating from this meeting to the procedural officer, copy to myself by close of business on Thursday. Allow me an opportunity to thank the support staff. Thank you, Mr. Kutsia, and the IT support. That is it from me. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chair.